Ya, Alejandro, ya confirmo que estamos en vivo. Vamos a comenzar a la 1 en punto. Pregunta.
Sí, Rafael, yo veo todos los panelistas conectados, así que te pediría de habilitar a todos y creo que sí estamos en condiciones de empezar a la 1.
Dame un segundo que le voy a dar co-host a los panelistas nada más para que ellos tengan la opción de desmutearse. Un segundo.
Perfecto.
Ya pueden comenzar. Voy a compartir la PPT y colocaré la grabación.
Buenos días, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Es un gran gusto.
Good morning. Welcome. Hope you're well. It's a pleasure to have you joining us here today, and it's a pleasure to be the moderator of today's event regarding the matter at hand. As we can see, we have before us a report that exposes a critical situation of education in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, clearly, the pandemic has resulted in significant problems for education systems around the globe, particularly in our region, but this has only worsened an education situation, a situation that was already quite serious prior to the pandemic. Now, in the 80s, there were crises. Then in the 90s, there were recessive economic situations, and these had a devastating effect on public budgets and on funding for education in particular, to such an extent that education coverage dropped significantly, and many of our countries today, we are still paying for the cost of that situation years ago. Now, all of this started to change during the first 15 years of this century, when the education systems in Latin America and the Caribbean and most of the countries underwent a certain amount of progress with regard to school coverage and investments, but not so much in terms of learning achievements. Now, these advances were quite modest, though, particularly when we take into consideration the significant setbacks and dramatic inequalities that are quite common in the region with regard to socioeconomic development and educational opportunities. Now, because of all of that, the report underscores how prior to the pandemic, we were very far off from meeting the 2030 education goals, specifically SDG4, which speaks to securing quality education for all throughout their entire lives. And today, given that slowdown in progress, in addition to the impact that the pandemic has had, the situation continues to be critical and further unequal. Now, it is in that context that the Secretary General Gutierrez of the UN has called us all to a meeting next week, because he's convinced that if we continue to do things the way we have done in the past, and continue to not assign the necessary resources required by the education system, we will not meet the objectives set forth. So this modest activity is quite timely, because this constitutes an urgent appeal to bring about this education transformation and to consider this a priority in terms of ethical aspects, social and economic aspects. Now, we all know that our countries are unique, and we all have to face our own singular economic and historic challenges. And many of us have not all been able to solve satisfactorily some of the issues that ECLAC referred to years ago, when ECLAC appealed to all of us to bring about development with equality and sustainable development. Now, we are clear, we know that education is the only way that we will be able to secure sustainable development and inclusive development. And we also know that if our hemisphere does not do away with the poverty trap and other aspects that have marked us throughout history, and if we do not have a more dynamic, more inclusive, and more sustainable development process with the new balance of power, it won't be possible for us to meet the objectives for education that have been set forth. Now, it might sound a bit cliche, but it continues to be true that education and development are the same faces of a single coin, the same sides of a coin. And we cannot have quality education if we have a second tier level of development. So once again, thank you for allowing me to moderate this event. And it's a pleasure to invite all of you here and to present to you the key speakers of the organizations involved in today's event. Each speaker will have 6 to 7 minutes for his or her presentation, and we will begin with the director of ECLAC's social division, Mr. Alberto Arenas. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Warm special greetings to Leonardo Garnier, a special advisor to the UN for education, our colleagues from UNESCO and UNICEF as well. We will be joining you in this presentation. I would like to greet the various education sector ministers, authorities from Uruguay, Argentina, Jamaica, other countries taking part in this parallel event. And I would like to thank Uruguay for the 4th presentation of the voluntary national report on the 2030 agenda related to the high-level political forum. This was submitted just yesterday, so kudos to you. Now, 7 years ago, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda was defined, and the UNESCO Regional Bureau for Education, OEALC UNESCO, and the UNICEF office, regional office for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as ECLAC, all submitted the first regional report on progress with regard to the implementation of SDG4 in Latin America and the Caribbean. This identified the various challenges and mapped out some steps forward as well with regard to making progress toward SDG4. This report also included statistics and data regarding global issues relative to monitoring SDG4, as well as supplementary information from the various countries and that which was available back then in order to move forward with some definitions and analyses. It also provides us with some background information and cites the current context with regard to education and education policies from 2015 to 2021. Now, these are key topics related to SDG4 and the 2030 agenda. Now, allow me to begin because, Leonardo, I was told that someone was supposed to share the joint tripartite presentation. Very well, thank you. I've already referred to this essentially. So we have this context, and it's relative to the social tendencies, economic tendencies, or trends rather in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, we all know that the pandemic has exacerbated the structural problems related to inequality, poverty, and informal labor markets, and the social and economic context throughout the region is quite relevant and a key component that would allow us to understand the various opportunities and challenges that the education systems face. We know that the pandemic, when it occurred, it was already it was disrupting a very complex situation. We were facing 7 years of low growth with increased rates of poverty and growing social tensions. And so the pandemic actually exacerbated structural inequalities, resulting in high levels of informality, a lack of social protection, and left many critical areas exposed, such as health, education, and the economy of care. And this resulted in new challenges for the economies in order to meet the SDGs. And the achievements in the last decade relative to education called for integrated, coordinated efforts. And we know that we call for more efforts to continue with this. Next slide, please. I cannot see this, but I will just continue forward with my own presentation. Now, given the situation triggered by the pandemic, as mentioned, we saw that the growth rate dropped significantly from 2000. When you see 2015 to 2022 data, you can see how it dropped from down to negative 6.8 in 2020, and then it spiked up, and now it's back down again. And the expectation for the region is 1.8% for 2022. Now, this is the estimated growth rate in terms of GDP in 2022. Now, we know that there's a very limited potential growth when compared to 2021, according to estimates, and these estimates are rounded down. And so public spending in social matters will be affected as well as in education. Next slide, please. Then, given that context, we know that there's another context related to poverty and extreme poverty. Essentially, the estimates that we have come up with reveal that poverty and extreme poverty for the sixth consecutive year are on the rise. Now, despite the growth that we saw in 2021, estimates still point to how extreme poverty will increase from 13, will increase down to 13.8%. And on the left, you have the total number of millions of individuals. 86 million individuals in 2021 are marked by extreme poverty. Now, that is the context that we're facing. And it's not just that poverty is growing, but inequalities are growing as well. From 2018 to 2020, you can see that there was well, prior to that, there was a downward trend, but the trend was reverted. You can see the Gini index shows an increase in inequalities. And this is essentially due to deteriorated distributive power or ratio throughout those years as a result of COVID-19. Now that, again, is the context. Next slide, please. Fiscal policies and increased social spending were put into play to try to counteract the impact of the pandemic. In Latin America and the Caribbean, social spending of central governments reached their historic high in Latin America. This represents a slight increase over 2014 to 2019, 2.1% increase in GDP spending on this, we can see on the slide. So the challenge is to maintain this constant level of social spending that was launched to correct the issues of the pandemic so that we can prevent further inequalities. We know that there's multidimensional inequalities, and many of these aspects have brought on additional challenges, clearly, that we are all aware of relative to education in the region, for example. Thank you.
Muy bien, buenas tardes a todos y todas.
Good afternoon, everyone. At UNESCO, I'm going to follow up this presentation of this social and economic context that Alberto Arenas just summarized for us. And I'd like to greet everybody who's on this call, specifically Leonardo Garnier, who was kind enough to chair this event, our colleagues at ICLAC, UNESCO, at the Permanent Mission of Uruguay that has led this side event, and of course, the representatives of the ministries that will be taking part in the following discussion. Before continuing, I'd like to offer the greetings from the director of the education unit of UNESCO, who, because of health reasons, is not able to attend, and I'm glad to be here instead of her. This second part will deal with some of the results of the educational sector that we will find in this monitoring report that, as Leonardo said in his introductory remarks, state that the objectives, the SDG4 by 2030 were not secured even before the pandemic, and let alone after these 2 years in which the educational systems in the region have been deeply impacted. Every time we do a sectoral analysis, the first dimension that we look at is access of children and teenagers to the educational system, especially to the different levels of education. This is what we can see here in this first chart, a long series of the last 20 years, where we see some trends that are quite marked and others that are starting to change. Our region, for many years, has those education levels that many of our countries consider as mandatory, such as primary education and the first cycle of secondary education, with a significant coverage, and that has been established for many years, although there are always populations to which access is difficult, and we're always lacking a few points in order to achieve that level of coverage. But those are levels that have a quasi-universal coverage. Is not the same what happens in the case of early childhood education or higher secondary education, where we still have a gap in terms of universal coverage, but with a significant growth in the last two decades. Now, what we'd like to state, which is an ongoing part of this analysis in this report coming from the three agencies, that with the years of the 2030 agenda as of 2015, one concern is a de-acceleration of growth. For example, looking at the secondary higher education trend, which showed significant growth until 2015. Between 2015 and 2020, that growth became stagnant, and that will happen in several of the dimensions that we've been discussing. The next one, please. One of the good pieces of news that we see when we look at the different trends is that, especially in primary and secondary education, there has been a significant improvement of what we call the educational trajectories, which like the transition between grades of the children and the transition in between levels has improved in these last few years. That means these levels were a constant in the region. For example, in primary education, the last 20 years, the percentage of overage of children, those who are 2 or 3 years older than what it should be expected for those grades, has been reduced from 14% to 8% in these 20 years. So there has been an improvement in that trajectory. That is also the impact also means that indicators such as the ratio between per teachers, there are fewer and fewer teenagers or children who attend each one of those classrooms. That has been a positive trend in the region. Another relevant indicator that in our region, the conclusion or completion of secondary education is a relevant indicator, especially what we call higher education. So that indicators show 12 years of schooling that IPLAC states that that is the minimum schooling that is required in order to get out of poverty circles that affect our region in general. There's work to do, of course. On average, the completion of secondary higher education completion is 64%. And this chart is showing the gaps that are also constant in our countries that exist among different types of populations. For example, if we look at the urban or rural context or as per income quintiles, there are gaps in our region that are quite structural, but also we must recognize that in time those gaps have been bridged gradually. It is a slow change, but they tend to converge to the closure of such gaps. So as we improve completion, as we improve access, those gaps are bridged. But of course, there's more work to do. Next one, please. Something that has been peculiar and that is mentioned in the monitoring report that is mentioned as something to be highlighted is the dynamics of the higher level education or tertiary education. There has been a significant increase in schooling levels and the coverage. This has not only been a phenomenon in the Caribbean and Latin America, it is a global phenomenon in our region. Is not an exception. Here, we see in the last 20 years that the enrollment has grown 3 times. We've gone from 11 million to 29 million students attending this level. Something we saw at the beginning as well. At the end of the period, we see how this curve changes its trend, and although there is no stagnation, but it's a clear deacceleration in the growth. This repeats itself in several dimensions. Next one. Something that we would like to highlight as well in the case of tertiary education is that unlike what we saw just now, just this convergence or the reduction of the gaps or bridging of the gaps are growing here. Tertiary education in our region seems to be at a time of a significant development, of significant growth, but that growth is not even. And it tends to increase some of those gaps. Here we see the difference between income quintiles, and we see a growing gap in the last few years. So something similar happens when we look at the gap between men and women. That is also growing. That's a call to attention. We know that tertiary education is peculiar, and within this universe, there are different types of contexts. There is graduate, postgraduate, university, college, or non-college education, and we need to look at it carefully. But looking at it in terms of access for the population, we see that those gaps are growing, and that should be discussed and analyzed about those who are responsible for such topics. Next one. Maybe this is the most or the biggest concern, and Leonardo Garnier talked about it in his opening remarks. One of the dimensions that practically has not shown any change during the 2030 agenda currency is the learning curve of students. There has not been an increase. Basically, there's been no movement in the minimum levels of competencies of the students measured through the education quality Latin American laboratory measurements. These are the standard assessments in order to develop information for SDG4 that we see here in primary level between third grade and sixth grade. There has not been a significant change. The same happens when we look at secondary education. Next slide, please. In this case, we measure it through the countries in the region that are part of that take the PISA assessment. There are 10 countries in Latin America, the Caribbean that go through this assessment. Situation is similar, low levels of learning, and we don't see significant movements between 2015 and 2020. This stagnation in the learning curve is maybe one of the most important alert signals that we see in the analysis of the achievement of SDG4. And now, in order to close, because I'm probably going beyond my time, the last chart, the last slide that I wanted to share with you, next one, are the indicators regarding educational financing. Next one, please.
Cuando miramos el financiamiento educativo,
when we look at financing in education, we tend to say that this is a mirror of the educational policy. It is a reflection of what happens in the educational sector. And so these indicators will be consistent or will be reflecting what we see in the rest of the trends. Here, there's also a significant warning sign here. We see that the region in the last 10 or 12 years prior to 2015 showed an expansion trend that was quite strong. And Alberto talked about it, also equating it to the economic context. Between 2004 and 2015, there had been a budgetary increase that was significant, that was reflected in these classic indications of financial effort to education, educational expenditure as a percentage of total state expenditure. That showed a significant behavior in that decade, but as of 2015, almost starting together with the 2030 agenda, there's a deterioration in those budgets. Educational budgets start to become stagnant, whereas the GDP or total expenditure keeps a different path or evolution. So this is a warning sign, because although we know that funding for education is not a sufficient condition so that the rest can grow, but we know that is a necessary condition. Without necessary resources, no educational policies can be implemented, and we need to reverse this trend if we intend to achieve 2030 by achieving the goals that countries have agreed to. Well, in order to continue this presentation and a follow-up with conclusions, I'd like to offer the floor to my colleague, thank you, Alejandro and Alberto, my colleague Italo Dutra. I'd like to supplement what UNESCO has said, and also what ICLAC presented, and also our chairperson, Leonardo Garnier. How can we see this until 2019, that is to say, before the pandemic, before the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a continuity in historical growth of these indicators. That is to say, we were improving a number of indicators, especially the ones about access to primary education, completion indicators related to primary education, a number of conclusions, a number of indicators that were showing an upward trend, although they were somewhat slow. That positive trend, of course, is a trend that was deaccelerating with, especially in terms of higher education or repeat rate in primary education. So that is to say, in this first slide, what I'm trying to summarize is that up until before the pandemic, there was a deacceleration trend, but we were still improving some of these indicators because this was a trajectory that started at the end of the 80s and 90s, and it went on growing during the 90s and onwards. So in the region, we have a number of indicators that improved, were in deaccelerating, and this growth is the growth that was part of a positive wave until 2019. The next one. Well, what happens is that in terms of trends at the time, and I want to emphasize that we are talking about trends up until 2019. A very concerning stagnation in educational inclusion in quality of learning and higher education. We were improving on average, but on an overall average, but there's a population that has historically been away or detached from the benefits and achievements that we are getting in the countries, which are populations that can be named in terms of ethnicities, geographies, and certain populations with with lower economic budgets. So that it is a very concerning indicator, and that was already there before the pandemic, and the significant increase of inequality in access and quality of the tertiary level, which is a consequence of a poor transition of primary education to tertiary education, primary, secondary to tertiary education. So we have this is the importance of looking at it in that context of different trends up until 2019, which was applicable to the majority of the data that comes out of the report we are introducing. And of course, we can think, and we can go to the next slide, to a number of challenges to address the stagnation. And of course, now we can talk about the learning crisis as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Now, of course, we must all agree that education is a fundamental human right. And often this human right is the gateway of access to other human rights for our boys, girls, adolescents, and young people and adults. So we must remember that. And we must make sure that education is a priority on our political agendas, on our economic agendas, as well as on the families' agendas within society, because that is also where we can see and verify certain movements, certain progress with regard to how society further values education. And of course, improving education indicators calls for coordinating a variety of different factors that are often beyond the purview of the education sector. For example, boosting social policies, social protection policies, and justice-related policies are intimately related to the potential achievements in the education sector, and not just referring to the quality and quantity of learning opportunities, but we also must focus on intersectoral coordination by the various sectors so that these achievements can be made and so that we can make great strides towards achieving SDG4. Now, let me also refer to a rising discussion or discourse in our region. Our region is actually very difficult to to cite a specific focus with regard to the education experience. I would say overall, there's a great discourse related to developing skills. And we have to figure out how to do that, how we can move from a more formative assessment structure to that will allow us to build these skills and build them downward and upward. Also, today, society has significantly moved to the digital realm. Therefore, we must consider involving digital technologies in the classroom, make sure these are innovative, and involving these in the various evaluation forms as well. All of our agencies are doing that, in fact, in order to provide support to the governments and education. And we're all trying to secure that schools are connected online and that the teachers as well are focusing on digital education and digital tools in the classroom. Next slide, please. And with this, I would like to draw my remarks to a conclusion, perhaps, specifically those related to the challenges, that is. Of course, we need the following, and we've been saying this for years. We need to focus on the teachers who can teach for the 21st century. We need to focus on their training, their education, so that they are prepared in terms of methodology, pedagogy, for the various challenges that they will have to face. For example, the digital divide, skill building for boys, girls, adolescents, youth, and young adults. So we must have programs that take into consideration lifelong learning and the skills we require throughout our entire lives. Now, these social changes or changes in the way we go about doing our work clearly have involved new skills, skills that we will need throughout our lifetimes. Secondary education also must be considered with a view towards transitioning to the next stage in life of adolescence. For example, when they graduate from high school and start working, or maybe they move on to university education, it's also important to bear in mind the role of higher education as a common good, and to make sure that we have policies fostering equal opportunity in terms of access. Moreover, we need to boost funding, investment for education, and have more efficient management policies as well that strive to foster more investment and better, more robust budgets at the various government levels. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining as well. Thank you for those speaking before me. And I would like to once again thank you for the commenting on the main conclusions of this report. And of course, we are available for Q&A.
Okay. Disculpen que no tenía acceso al audio. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for those presentations. I know we always are short on time at these events. So now allow me to give the floor to 5 colleagues from the region who will answer 2 questions. Originally, we had scheduled 3 minutes, but I will give you just a few minutes per question. So just let me quickly say the first question. I'm not just going to repeat what was mentioned, but we know that we just heard a great description about the current context. So how do you, which in your opinion are the critical transformations we require, not just to bounce back from the impact of the pandemic, but also to make that leap forward that will truly allow us to meet the SDG4 target, and that is quality education for all. So 2 to 3 minutes per person. Perhaps we could start with the representative from El Salvador. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I am here on behalf of the Minister of Education of El Salvador, who apologizes for not being here. He was called away to different responsibilities at the very last minute. So let me try to summarize some of the aspects that the minister wanted to share with you. Now, from within Salvador, we know it's key to learn from the pandemic, from the lessons learned. And what we would like to first point out as relevant is the fact that no country was prepared to face such a situation. So what progress have we made, or how have we tried to face the crisis? That, in explaining that, that leads me to my first remark. Now, cooperation between the countries is key. We need to ensure that we have a regional dialogue to learn together. We believe that is essential. Without that, we will not make continual progress. We also believe that though we have seen how important it is to have a robust state and solid, sound public institutions to meet society's demands, claims, and rights. For example, public schooling. We know that public schooling is a significant strength in times such as these. Now, we also believe, thirdly, that it is essential to underscore how the pandemic exposed the gap existing between those who consume education and those who produce education. We believe that we need to reinforce our public universities, for example, to address this, to try to close this gap. And also regarding other relevant aspects, we believe there are two key components that must be mentioned. The first is related to taking the participation of the education community seriously in terms of designing policies, etc. It's also important to involve families, students, and teachers as well in order to close this learning gap. And then finally, something very valuable from our perspective is taking this crisis and trying to embrace this as an opportunity. We know that the crisis was very challenging and painful, and it's an opportunity, though. What we did was come up with a quick response and tried to make the institutional capacities more robust so that they could be used as tools to face the specific context, and the growing divide as well. Thank you. Thank you, Carlos Enrique Rodriguez. Now we will hear from Roberto Silva, the president of the National Administration of Public Education of Uruguay. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I will attempt to answer your question. Now, clearly, the situation we faced regionally in terms of education have made it necessary for us to work harder towards securing the right of all of our citizens. Very complex situation. Now, in this regard, I think what we need to do is go beyond our own sector, the education sector, and work specifically on intersectoral coordination policies in all the various social sectors so that we can set up a positive social ecosystem that would have an impact on the population at large, but specifically on those who are most disadvantaged. And now we know that we cannot do this without having a policy that will focus on social issues as a whole, in which education plays a key role. Secondly, we must go beyond electoral periods, and we must have public policies that are an expression of the most possible consensus. And we need to ensure continuity so that this would have a positive impact on our abilities to attain our national policy objectives. Now, we cannot conceive policies that are tied to administrations, but rather state policies. That's what we've done in Uruguay. Now, if you are able to attack this from those two premises, then we could have a multi-sectoral impact, and we would like to have evidence that would allow that would be a tool for future decision makers. Often one of the issues that we have seen in our context is that the governments change, administrations change, policies change, and there's very little information passed on, very little evidence passed on. And then finally, we need to efficiently use our public resources. We need to be aware of the fact that governors are managing public funds that are earmarked for us to meet our national objectives. Therefore, every peso, every dollar used must have the most possible impact. And here, in this regard, we need to have coordinated education policies coordinated with other sectors, a well-informed policy that works with individuals who go beyond the political comings and goings and who are more concerned with state policies, a policy that will focus on the future and that will bring about evidence for decision-making down the road, an education policy that will optimize the use of public resources and in order to ensure that we secure the expected impact in every case. In Uruguay and in the rest of our countries, education is clearly part of all social policy platforms. So today, even more than in the past, we need to focus on that objective and not lose that from sight. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, let's continue then. Andrea Garcia, she is the Educational Cooperation and Priority Action Secretariat of Argentina. Thank you for the invitation to ECLAC. Thank you, Leonardo, and to our colleagues that are on this call today. We have a huge challenge and there's no time to waste in order to recover, repair, and to transform our educational systems when facing these common challenges in our region that have been worsened by the impact of COVID in the educational trajectory or life of boys, girls, teenagers, and adults. And for that, and for the time, or for this occasion, two main considerations. First one is that any transformational process should take place with the students at the center of all policymaking efforts, including all those who are not attending school, and improving the learning of those who are part. There's no possible quality if we're not all part of the educational system to cater to their interests, needs, projects, so that they can find in education a project for life by expanding access to all, to knowledge, science, art, culture, and sports. Quality education should not be a privilege of a few. We should expand the democratic learning opportunities throughout the lifetime in order to cater to the well-being and transformation aspirations of all students. Transformation and change process should take place with educators as part of such transformation. There's no transformation process that is possible if it is against, in spite of, or without educational workers. It is with educational workers and their organizations with whom we must discuss, diagnose, and build projects catering to transformation. So with the students at the center of the decision making and with the teachers and educators as part of the effort, the organized community should discuss what education and what country do we want to transform it after the pandemic. The second consideration now would be that so that right to education become a reality, state should guarantee it, that they should guarantee its budget and funding. You cannot exercise your right to education without funding, and this funding depends on political decisions, economic decisions, and it's strictly connected with sovereignty of countries and the relationship with the world economic order that conditions the countries in the region in order to invest what's necessary so that for transformation to exist, no external debt process should limit the educational funding nor condition the shortening or bridging of gaps in terms of social equality in which we all were working for. Education, and we agree it's a public good and a personal and social right, fundamentally because of its multiplying effect because it provides access to other rights, but it is with the state that you can guarantee it and with financing that it can become a right with access to all. Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. We don't have the other two members of the panel, so we're going to go to the next question with the three colleagues that are with us, which would be the next within the framework of UNESCO's call to forge a new pact in order to rethink the future of education and in the context of the invitation of the Secretary General of the United Nations to a World Summit or a Transforming Educational Summit. How would you address, from the context of your countries, this transforming vision of education, considering the challenges of our times, climate change crisis, growing inequality, technology changes associated to digitalization, and the challenges to democracy and to citizenship in a society in which globalization coexists with political systems that are still national in nature. So there's a number of trends quite conflicting that we're facing. And the question is, would be, how do we envision the critical transformations of education in this context? So we will start with our colleague from the Ministry of Education of El Salvador, Carlos. Thank you. From our point of view, the issue of environmental challenges such as or as well as technological changes should be addressed from a global citizenship approach. So the key part of this question is that what type of citizenship are we going to build from the educational systems in order to address these two issues and other associated issues such as, for example, consumerism and democratic political participation of the new generation. So it is clear that training citizens for the present times requires the capability of critically relating to the past, communication skills in order to establish dialogue and understanding, the capability to responsibly consume thinking of others, and so many other aspects. However, for us, the level of the critical involvement is the most important one in order to educate citizens. The first dimension of those critical dimensions is the contextual one, is the capacity to examine the socio-historical context in which students are located. Now, that dimension assumes other points of view and to mediate among different positions or stances. In this dimension, skills such as active listening, open mind, and alternative perspectives are quite constructive in order to work democratically. Finally, the pragmatic dimension states the importance of practicality, skills such as decision making, either individual or collective problem resolution, and to identify consequences, among others. So this is how we think of a critical thinking that transcends the impartial, neutral vision of a universalist individual that exercises critical thinking in itself and for him or herself. Also, in these aspects, in the topic that we are discussing, from our perspective, it is clear that without critical and autonomous citizens, we are not going to be able to address the environmental crisis, which can be one of the effects of highly societies that are highly invaded by technology. Now, from the point of view of the educational systems, this is not only achieved by changing the curriculum. We know that it is important to train our teachers well, but also to build a new school, a new educational territory, and we need to build that curriculum as a socio-political process where social sectors are not only consulted in order to define the major topics, but somehow they are also part of the curriculum implementation by modifying their deleterious practices or the ones that go against the construction of the citizens that we have discussed. Now, against the trend to underrate the curriculum approach, we'd like to highlight the importance of assuming that these overall or global citizenship construction are not only the responsibility of a single subject matter. We are introducing this into mathematics, social sciences, and we would like to promote collaboration among teachers in order to develop this pedagogic mediation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carlos Enrique. Well, on to Robert Silva from ANEP, Uruguay. Well, here in Uruguay, we are developing and implementing also a process that we have identified as educational transformation process based on the history of our educational systems, especially in our case of Uruguay, and thinking already of the future challenges. Now, in the time we've been allotted, I'd like to tell you that in Uruguay, we have three main pillars that we believe in the context of a pandemic situation that we have faced, and from which we have in which we have applied so many strategies, we can make progress to a necessary curricular transformation at all educational levels, to make progress in the development of a teachers, a national policy that understands the graduate training of our educators, their professional career path, ongoing their training, their career path based on their assessment and performance, and what we have called or identified as the working conditions that make the performance of those key actors in the educational sector more professional and more hierarchical. Now, when we talk about the autonomy of educational establishments or communities that from the reality of their own context can address their own situation with the three lines across the board that we believe, and even more so in the case of COVID, equality, technology, and inclusion. And now delving deeper into this question, we believe it is important as to technology changes and digitization. In Uruguay, we have developed public policies that have transcended administrations, from inclusion of such topic of IT into the curriculum back in 1995, educational connectivity processes that enabled the arrival of what is identified as the Saival plan in our country. Public education administration, ANEP, we are responsible for mandatory education, of establishing educational policy for those levels, managing public educational establishments, and as a controlling agency of private institutions, and also teachers education has developed articulated actions very strongly lately with the Saival Innovation Agency, known as the Saival Plan, with a strong impact and to what digitization is all about. Making our progress to keep on making progress. We believe that is an important component in order to cater to the uncertainties and issues that we face today. In that sense, we have consolidated the delivery of tablets or devices or computers to first graders that are starting primary education, or third grade, those who are in first grade of higher education, either technical or vocational. And we are making progress towards higher education. Also, the installation of educational platforms, strategies such as programming, activities on computational thinking, national Olympic games on robotics, development of technological labs in all our educational establishments. Also, the teaching of English by using video conferencing. More than 1,800 educational establishments in Uruguay, public ones, with the involvement of national and foreign teachers, acquiring new platforms adaptive platforms to subjects such as math and languages, and we also provide recreational and textbooks for the different education levels to the entire country within a framework that we learned during the pandemic of lots of training that we lacked in our teachers, teams, and our students. And at the same time, and I'd like to especially emphasize on an important change that we are experiencing, which is the curriculum transformation that Uruguay is carrying on. And as our colleague from El Salvador said, it plays a significant role, has established a number of overall competencies that students must achieve with a significant emphasis on the competency base associated to computer thinking, which is understood as a way of reasoning, expressing, and solving problems from the logic of computers. It includes the processes to discuss a situation, identifying and using computational tools in order to address those problems by knowing the operation of such tools and the possibility of addressing or solving problems by being able to think critically and creatively, competencies that we have also established in our curriculum. Computational thinking is necessary because we live in a more digital world in which the economy and the exercise of our citizenship is becoming more and more digital. In that context, that some call the fourth industrial revolution, algorithms are more and more important. They guide our behavior, our social interactions in different walks of life, also linked to artificial intelligence. There are more 50,000 students in Uruguay that are part, and that's growing. Close to 2,500 teachers are also part of this in primary education. Just like to mention, now following up the question, spirit, the work that we are completing in terms of connecting it to environmental education and sustainable development in order to promote environmental education in the entire country at all educational levels, with an emphasis on preserving life from a comprehensive perspective, with the added purpose of that environmental education is across the board in terms of our curriculum by establishing agreements with national authorities that have competence in that field and developing a national educational strategy on environment in the entire country. Also that in the context, as our colleague said, of a broad participation.
But sometimes what you tend to detect, and this is very important because our generations are calling for this, because our challengers are forcing us to rise to the urgent need to make decisions. This involves a lot of participation and always trying to reach consensus. But let's not forget, as governors, that we must make decisions. Now, the new demands in the education sector are challenging us to work from a holistic, systemic, and comprehensive perspective so that we can move forward even during the pandemic. We truly value technological progress. In Uruguay, for example, we went from 20,000 users to 800,000 users on our platform, and we have done away with old outdated evaluation practices. We have also supported further our students and teachers so that we can be ahead of certain problems and solve other problems, such as minimal learning through memory or past traditional processes. In the end, the challenges and uncertainty that we have faced have forced us to address issues from a macro perspective, from the national perspective and regional perspective as well, as we said during the previous answer, and specifically with regard to education, with regard to the changes and lines of action that we must carry out. That's what we have done. We've attacked this problem from that perspective. Thank you. Andrea Garcia from Argentina, you have been recognized. Thank you. I agree with a large number of the concepts, convictions that have been expressed thus far by those who've taken the floor before me. Now, allow me to mention that in Argentina, the priorities of the national education policy are explained through a 21-206 national education law. which defines that the budget must not be less than 6% of the GDP. The education financing law also says 0.2% of current revenue for the consolidated budget should be earmarked for the National Technical Education Fund. And we have this National Science Encouragement Law as well that states that 1% of the GDP goes to education as well. And then we have another law enacted last year to foster our education system. Now, this is how the system is sustained, and the priorities have been stated under the 21-27 policy for fair quality education. This was adopted by the Assembly and all the various jurisdictions in Argentina within the federal government, along with the representatives of the state and private university council members. We define 3 strategic objectives and education goals from 2023 to 2027. This is in keeping with the targets defined under SDG 4 of 2030 agenda. Now, with regard to number 1, that is to secure access of students to the education system nationwide. Number 2, to strengthen the teaching and learning processes to boost education quality. Objective 3, to provide the necessary resources to improve the conditions where teaching and learning processes occur. Now, with regard to the measures that we have taken to secure access to education, 192 days of class time have been agreed to. We have also implemented and expanded a scholarship system called Progressar, which is for young people from 16 to 24 years of age. This is a scholarship system that has a coverage of 1.4 or 1.5 million students in the education system. And a series of programs were also drawn up to secure the return to in-person classes for those who were not in school, and investments as well in a program for policymakers, basically, at the educational establishment level. So we are also working on adding 1 additional hour of class time in the primary school system per day. We hope to secure this by the end of the year for a total of 25 hours of class a week. We have also distributed native language math books to all of the students in the primary school system in Argentina, and we are working on having a new system for environmental and sex education. With regard to the second education objective, we have boosted teacher training to secure national gender parity as well, nationwide. We are also working on a program to foster equality, and 600 devices so far have been distributed to different students, computer devices in the secondary school, and 90% of the education establishments of the integral Argentinian education system have participated. So we're working on all of these objectives, and we are fully committed to this so that all boys, girls can be at school. That's the best place for our young people to be, so that we can secure efforts to close the inequality gap. Thank you. Thank you. All right, we have fewer participants, so we have a bit more time. Allow me to ask our three original speakers if they would like to take the floor, and perhaps you could focus on one of the key ideas expressed under the report. For example, if you had to take only one issue mentioned under that report, what would it be? What would you work on? Alberto, would you like to begin? Sure. Thank you for that, Leonardo, for giving me the floor again. Now, it's very interesting what we've heard thus far. I've enjoyed listening to the opinions of El Salvador, Uruguay, and Argentina. I would like to refer to two aspects. The first is something quite macro in nature. You actually mentioned this early on in your welcoming remarks. And I am referring to the importance of investing in education. Any successful strategy relative to development and sustainable development calls for inclusive social development, and any inclusive social development strategy calls for investing in education, which is essentially investing in people, investing in our human capital, which is the most important asset of all of our countries. Now, in that context, and specifically in a region where inequality reigns, and where we have said in a variety of different fora how inequality is on the rise, education is a key tool, a concrete tool to address that inequality. And countries who have mapped out their progress toward better education will have an impact. So if I had to refer to certain aspects of the report regarding implementing SDG4 related aspects, I would say that tragically, the pandemic has had a significant impact on our progress. It's affected the health sector, the economics of our countries, etc., and clearly has resulted in a stagnant situation regarding development. Therefore, we will have to redouble our efforts so that we can actually meet the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. With this, I would like to close. What you also mentioned is important, that is financing for education. That's not the only way we're going to solve the problem, as mentioned by Roberto Silva from Uruguay. The governments and the countries and their economic policies and decisions with regard to how they consider education as a priority is essential, so that resources allocated could actually result in more resources. And this is an opportunity. I repeat, the pandemic is an opportunity so that we can have new social compacts and new decisions that will foster greater investments in education so that we can actually reach SDG 4 and the 2030 agenda. So thank you. Alejandro, go ahead.
Muchas gracias, Leonardo, y me sumo Alberto también.
Thank you for that. I would just like to echo what was mentioned by the previous speakers. Very interesting to hear from Uruguay, Argentina, and El Salvador. Just to quickly summarize some of the key messages of this report, I would have to say that the message is that education in our region is at a crossroads. What we have tried to show with regard to the trends that we have referred to today is that education in our region was slowing down. The progress was slowing down even prior to the pandemic. Now, certain policy decisions were made, of course, and as a result of that, a great deal of the growth from the region slowed down from 2015 to 2020. And then, to make matters worse, the pandemic. Statistics have unfortunately prevented us from perfectly reflecting this in the report, but other reports have shed some light on to that education has suffered greatly, specifically in terms of learning, or the dropout rate, mental health has suffered as well. Many situations have worsened. And as Alberto said, we have witnessed how in recent years, in 2021, education has not necessarily been a priority with regard to government strategies to face the pandemic, and even less so to face the recovery period. The countries from the region, I think, are on the verge of having to make a decision with regard to the future of their education decisions and the path that we would like to go down. Would we like to revert this trend? Clearly, and if we want to do so, we will have to map out our future steps. So Uruguay, Argentina, and El Salvador have specifically referred to many of the issues being discussed. For example, the decisions being made today will be key for the future and to what we committed to in 2015 toward the end of the decade. But it's not going to be easy, but the decisions that we make today will be key in allowing us to make steps toward the targets that we have set out to attain. And let's not waste this opportunity. Thank you. Italo.
Thank you, Leonardo. And thank you for allowing me to comment on this. I don't think I can add so much more to what I said before, but I might like to emphasize on this situation. We have right now in 2022, still there are countries that have not been able to have open schools with boys, girls, and teenagers all attending school 5 days in a row. Still, today, we do not have assessment of the lessons lost, so to speak, during the COVID. We are starting to have some assessment or some idea of some data of thinking of Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, or others, and the data that are there are quite concerning. So on our part, we believe we are in an emergency mode, so to speak. The loss of learning has extended in schools for a long period of time, and that left schools in a situation of going back, that set schools back in many years in terms of what boys and girls and teenagers were able to learn in the region. So now, since we are approaching the Transforming Education Summit in November with all governments and the United Nations present, thinking of transforming education, that is fundamental. It is fundamental to act in order to reverse the trends in this learning curve. The reason writing, reading, and math is key. There's a need to think what are the methodologies to teach skills that are necessary for the 21st century and for the kind of school we need in this century, so that boys, girls, and teenagers of the 21st century, which is now, And it is a very significant topic if we are talking about, if we were talking about inequalities in this region. Right now, we are all at a time, a dangerous moment when inequality gaps are growing, where if we are not able to act quickly to recover that loss of learning, we will go back to a much more critical situation in education in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we need to get together. This is a joint effort required from international organizations, society, and governments and the civil society to make progress and to have education in the priority agenda. Not only that, but in the emergency agenda. We need to act now. We cannot wait any longer. Thank you all. Thank you, Italo. I'd like to thank all participants. I'd like to just give you a few closing remarks. I think these final remarks from Alberto, Alejandro, and Italo clearly show the feeling of not only of crossroads, but also an emergency. There are positive elements, but there are some that are quite a concern. Among the positive aspects of the opportunities that we could leverage to transform education, and many of the panel members highlighted, I'd like to mention two. One that I believe was quite evident in the discussion is that many times in Latin America and the Caribbean, we do not take advantage of learning of what other countries are doing. We are countries that have so many things in common, and practically all of us are doing significant efforts not only to address the pandemic consequences, but also to go beyond, as Italo said. But there's not enough communication. ICLAC has insisted on the integration efforts, but the educational sector is one in which we could be taking advantage of the experience of other countries. Maybe there is an area here in which now this could be even more important than any other, and it has to do with how the pandemic has led us to do a more intensive use of the digital revolution that many of you mentioned. We have seen the problems of inequality in terms of inequality access to devices or connectivity. Some countries have made more progress than others, but it's not only a matter of access to technology. The issue is also in terms of access to learning digital resources and teaching digital resources that are typical public goods. And one of the issues discussed that will be discussed during the Transformative Education Summit is that United Nations in particular and the whole planet should make a decision that these resources should be designed and generated and distributed as public resources with open access, free of charge, available to any teacher, any student. And I believe Latin America is one of those regions that has a huge opportunity to lead a process of this nature, where we can share the digital resources that are available. That on the side of opportunities, there are also important threats that were mentioned today. And I'm only thinking of those that are more difficult to address. And we saw it in the presentation that we saw in the report, the funding on education or financing of education. In recent data, we read from the education financing report of the World Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF. There's a huge topic. Many times we talk about education funding as a percentage of GDP or as a percentage of total expenditure. And we saw today that in both senses, there is a reduction of financing or investment on education in the continent. But I believe beyond the percentage of the GDP or percentage of expenditure, we need to think of how much are we spending per student and per child, because there are many children outside the educational system in many countries, and those are different data. According to the data in such report, educational inequalities in the world are huge. The richest countries invest more than $8,000 per individual during schooling years a year. Middle income countries, middle to upper income countries, in which many of the Latin American countries are located, invest close to $1,000.
Ingresos bajos medios
Low income countries invest $275 per year per individual, and African countries, they're investing less than $50 per individual. So look at the gap, look at the difference or the distance between $50 and more than $8,000 per person. That is the magnitude of the educational funding problem. And here, I'd like to think, because we've said many times that it is a matter of will. As Idalo said, we cannot let this go. And in this, I believe ICLAC has particularly clear when they declared the necessity or the need for this fiscal agreement. We cannot detach the education funding from the type of education or the growth of our countries. Many of the countries in Latin America fall into this category that are caught in a low-level equilibrium where there is an abundant, low-cost labor that attracts a low productivity investment. And if that is the case, the profitability will not depend on the human capital, but it will depend on the fact of keeping either labor salaries low or the cost of natural resources. And we are in a vicious circle in that case that has been quite typical in the region. And in that vicious circle, in a country that is part of this raises in which, in order to bring in foreign investment, I'm going to offer tax incentives, or in order to incentivize local projects that are also going to give tax incentives. That is a type of development for which what we always say, that education is an investment and not an expenditure, is not necessarily true. If my wager, so to speak, is on the low unit cost of the labor and the cost of natural resources, what I'm saying that is, I'm not betting on what some authors call human capital, not the better term, of course, but we're not betting on education. I think we understanding that the type of education that we give ourselves will have to be connected with the type of growth we would like to achieve is key. And I believe that this is only going to change when those sectors that are excluded, not only from education, but from learning, as we read in the report, only when these individuals really regain their right to education, they will have access to that. Some of those who spoke before me emphasized on the importance of social involvement of students, educators, and families. If we do not think of education as a right, I believe we must remember, and we need to, we've said this many times before, that human rights have not always been graciously granted. Human rights have been fought for in the case of funding of education. I believe the critical and the crossroads that Alejandro mentioned will truly demand a struggle for the funding of such initiative. Otherwise, in 10 more years, we're going to be holding the same kind of meeting, saying that once again, we lost an entire generation.
No sé si de parte de los
Okay, I
organizadores.
don't know if the organizers would like to close the activity, or should we close?
Simplemente
Or
agradecemos.
maybe we should simply thank, then we'd like to thank the 3 colleagues that presented the report, as well as the 3 colleagues that enriched this discussion with their country's experience. There are more than 100 40 people who followed this event. Thank you very much. Thank you, Leonardo, and everyone who participated, and all colleagues from UNESCO and UNICEF and El Salvador, Argentina, and Uruguay. Thank you all for being part of this. Pleasure. Goodbye.